Hey folks, we're just waiting for everyone to make their way from the waiting room into the main virtual room, I guess. We'll get going in a couple of minutes. Just while you're waiting, as we usually do, if you could respond to the three questions from the outset. Who are you? What grade levels do you teach or support? And the extent to which you currently incorporate or support learning on climate change in your practicum or practice. Take a couple of minutes to do that, and then we'll introduce our speaker and get underway. Okay, good afternoon, good evening, pre-service teachers, in-service K-12 teachers, administrators, policymakers, professors, faculty of education staff. Welcome to the sixth of seven Climate Change Education in the Manitoba Education System webinars. I'm so happy to welcome you here. I hope you all had a great day, great week. Our sixth webinar will focus on climate or eco-anxiety, and our guest speaker today is Heather Krepsky. And I'm so thankful that Heather is here this evening to speak to this topic because I know so many of you are keen to learn more about this to support your work with young people in Manitoba. Dr. Heather Krepsky is a faculty member at the University of Winnipeg, located on Treaty 1 and the homeland of the Métis Nation. Her research focuses on children's well-being or well-becoming, educational equity, ethics in education, children's autonomy rights, and assessment. In her work on the distribution of goods and opportunities for well-being in school, Krepsky argues that students are entitled to a greater participation rights in the decisions about their own well-being. She is a member of the Wellbeing and Wellbecoming in Schools in Canada Research Initiative and is currently working on several projects about children's well-being in Canada. Heather has been a teacher and a curriculum leader in the Toronto District School Board and has worked as an instructor at Toronto Metropolitan University in the Learning Success Center. She's also a phenomenal post-secondary educator, and I know some of you on the call have had the privilege of being in Heather's class. Again, so thankful that Heather has agreed to join this webinar series, and welcome to all of you, and welcome to Heather. Heather, take it away.
Thank you so much, Will, for that introduction that I'm not sure was deserved. I'll go ahead and share my screen here. Just have a bit of a cough, so I apologize in advance for a few interruptions. And okay, I think we'll get started. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here on the sixth of a seven-part series, Accelerating Climate Change Education in the Manitoba K-12 Education System. Thank you to all the folks who are involved in organizing this exceptional series. I've learned so much over the past weeks, and I feel especially grateful to be working alongside so many committed and brilliant climate justice advocates. Thanks especially to you, Will, for your leadership with this initiative toward climate action and in our faculty in so many ways. So my name is, as Will mentioned, Heather Krepsky, and today I'll share a few thoughts on the topic of supporting students who experience climate or eco-anxiety. I'll use these words interchangeably, though I can appreciate there might be ways that people understand these terms differently. Now, I was told when I was in the BEd program a long, long time ago that I should never start a presentation or a lesson with a disclaimer. And yet, I'm actually about to throw that advice out the window because I really do feel I need to admit at the outset, I'm fairly new to this particular field of inquiry. My research background is really situated in the area of children's and student well-being. But over the past several years, and particularly thanks to the generosity of colleagues like Mike Link and Will Burton, as well as a recent opportunity I've had to work with the Prairie Climate Center, I've grown and I've deepened my understandings of the intersection between student well-being and climate justice. So I hope I do justice to this topic today. And if you have any complaints or concerns, just forward them to w.burton@uwinnipeg.ca. Sorry, Will. Recognizing we gather this afternoon virtually, many of us are joining from Treaty 1 territory, which is situated on the traditional lands and territories of the Indigenous peoples and the original homeland of the Red River Métis Nation. I take this opportunity to acknowledge I live and work with a growing understanding of the treaties that were made on these territories and acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past and present. The land and the gatherings that take place in this region have historical, social, political, and material significance for the physical and mental health and climate challenges children, youth, families, Indigenous groups, and communities face today. I acknowledge all our municipal water is sourced from Shoal Lake 40 First Nation on Treaty 3. 80% of the energy that heats our homes and powers our computers is sourced from hydroelectric dams on the Nelson River in Treaty 5, and that oil used to fuel some of our cars is mined from the tar sands on Treaty 8 territory. I personally enter into this discussion today with what I hope is good intention and as part of an ongoing commitment to work and live in partnership and in parallel with Indigenous communities in the spirit of truth-seeking and truthful acts, reconciliation and collaboration, and ongoing dialogue about what justice and self-determination for Indigenous communities means and how it can be enacted through service, teaching, scholarship, and collaboration. And on that note, I'll share just an overview of the themes I plan to touch upon in the next 45 minutes or so. I'll first offer some context by outlining some of what I think are the relevant aspects of our current context, particularly in schools. Next, I'll speak a little to the nature of anxiety and how we might define it. And by way of applying these concepts, I'll introduce you to 3 fictitious students, each experiencing climate anxiety in different ways. I'll then go on to share a broad overview of the 3 different approaches I think can offer educators some guidance or reassurance that what we're doing to support student well-being is important, impactful, and meaningful, both in the short and long term. And finally, I'll offer just a quick closing thought and stick around, of course, for any questions. So let's begin. To set the stage a little bit, and I know just by attending this webinar, you're either here for a certificate or you're part of the what I call the choir in the Church of Climate Advocates, so to speak. But perhaps because we're all coming from different mindsets and maybe your day involved a series of stressful situations that were quite removed from thinking about this topic, I'll say just a few things to situate us in the context of well-being and why addressing well-being is so urgently needed in schools today. I am so sorry. As I see it, the urgency of the current mental health and well-being crisis can perhaps be best laid out by piecing together what the following 3 community groups are sort of, in my view, shouting from the rooftops. Educators state very clearly they feel unequipped to successfully support student mental health, well-being, and eco-anxiety. They see these needs from their students, and they cite the need for more resources, time, training, and supports. Governments and professionals who work in the field clearly and for quite some time recommend greater attention to child and youth mental health and well-being. And finally, students themselves, whenever given the space to voice their experiences, and they have been reporting an increase in mental health challenges, of which anxiety is the most reported issue. So What is the connection between student well-being and schools? And what, if any, part of the business of schooling legitimately addresses student well-being? For us educators, as a field, to believe in the capacity and mission for schools to address health and well-being, I think it's necessary to explicitly identify the things that we hope schools will accomplish, particularly because not everyone's in agreement about the purposes and the aims for education. And the answer to this question is not a neutral one. There are some folks who believe and would argue through a human capital lens that schools are intended to build a strong labor market and maximize the production of skills needed in the economy. Here, schools are like teaching factories. They're transforming children essentially into articles of commerce and instruments of labor. By this priority, if you as a student don't see yourself among the highest or most valued contributors as a consumer capitalist, you might think of your life, in fact, your very self, your identity, as a failure. This purpose and aim for schooling highlights the tension so many of our students in K-12 are facing. Wanting to feel like a success according to our political and economic structure, while wanting to feel like a success according to their desire to protect the planet. Though the two are not always in opposition, someone I'll never forget, engaging in a very healthy debate with, argued to find oneself in a job that doesn't have to have negative implications for the planet is to find oneself in a position of significant cognitive privilege. Alternatively, the purpose and aim for school education might look closer to what Thomas Falkenberg, and I think I saw him here today, hi Thomas, reminds us is what most parents want for their children from the moment they're born. That is student well-being and overall flourishing. Some schools and school districts are slowly transforming to embody a well-being lens, which reimagines schools as sites of flourishing, meaning that schools provide equitable opportunities for students to develop skills and dispositions for personal fulfillment, autonomous decision-making, building healthy relationships, creativity, resilience, hope, belonging, participation, and more. In other words, where schools are viewed as sites of human flourishing. And I think that tension between these two views is increasingly important and can help us educators frame our role in addressing the mental health crisis. We can see from research, child and youth mental health in Manitoba is in a state of crisis. And this crisis has only added strain on Manitoba's teachers, administrators, the already under-resourced healthcare system, parents, caregivers, and students. In Canada, data from 2019 shows 1 in 5 children were experiencing a reported mental health illness, and 2/3 were not able to access the mental health services they needed. Child and youth anxiety, depression, and suicide are on the rise across the country, particularly in Manitoba. Children are increasingly diagnosed with anxiety disorders, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, conduct disorder, depression, and post-traumatic stress disorder at a very early age. Last year, 91% of schools reported needing more support for students' mental health and well-being. We also know, as has been mentioned throughout the webinar series, that low income and childhood poverty are significant factors leading to adverse mental health outcomes throughout childhood. Now, that gives us a sense for the urgency of addressing well-being in our work with children and youth more broadly, but thankfully there are researchers who are addressing specific causes, including climate-specific causes for youth mental illness. A Canadian study published just last year by Galway and Field clearly demonstrates how young Canadians are experiencing a range of significantly challenging climate emotions. They found out of 1,000 youth, 56% reported feeling afraid, sad, anxious, and powerless. 78% reported climate change impacts their overall mental health, and 37% reported that their feelings about climate change negatively impact daily functioning. A global study in 2021 by Hickman and colleagues found on average worry about climate change impacts the functioning of 45% of youth across 10 countries. You can also see in this chart anywhere from 18% to 49% of youth report feeling extremely worried about climate change. I would argue that our outdated models for school education just aren't really working anymore, and they aren't keeping up with the changing landscape of our newest generation, a generation that increasingly feels hopeless and anxious about the climate crisis, has had many sources of meaning and joy taken away during the pandemic, and a generation contending with inescapable pressures of social media and technological distractions, which, among other things, exposes children to the realities of wildfires, drought, hurricanes, smoke exposure, emissions, heat waves, heat-related deaths, and other climate-related emergencies and damage. Because they are so integral to the lives of children and youth, schools are a natural social and emotional learning environment. Schools then are one of the best places, I think, for effective promotion and interventions in physical, cognitive, spiritual, and emotional health. In other words, schools can have a significant impact on improving the mental health and well-being of students. To say it a little differently, as my academic hero in Hall Pass writes, schools can and should be sites for human flourishing. Before I turn to the next section, I'll punctuate this shift with a quote from a high school principal who's referring to student mental health. "We are drowning. I've never seen it like this. Even during COVID, it was better than now. Everyone is struggling and we don't know what to do to make it better. A crisis is coming in education." In this next section, then, I'll try to dig a little bit more into how we might define eco-anxiety. I'll introduce 3 student archetypes as well, who represent some of the various ways students might be experiencing eco-anxiety in our classrooms. Okay, so I think as a starting point here, we might want to consider how to define anxiety more broadly. Some anxiety, of course, is a normal emotional and physical reaction to stress. For instance, a student might feel nervous before a test or a new social situation. When anxiety becomes excessive and overwhelms a student to the point that it interferes with daily life activities, though, they may actually have severe anxiety, chronic anxiety, or an anxiety disorder. Similarly, stress is vital for human survival. So as a starting point, we might define stress as a physical, emotional, or mental state of tension. However, as many of us know, too much stress can be harmful and lead to anxiety. Students with anxiety are constantly stressed and excessively worried about real or imagined circumstances. In addition to feeling overwhelmed with current stressors, students with anxiety are consumed with perceived future threats. Anxiety is the most common mental health concern for children and youth today. And as someone whose daughter struggles with anxiety, I can personally attest to the reality that there is a much greater prevalence of anxiety in youth than what's formally diagnosed in schools or what comes across our desks as teachers. Considering this rough definition of anxiety, then, how might we define eco or climate anxiety? Eco-anxiety or climate anxiety is a relatively new term, recognizing the widespread worries young people and adults experience related to climate change. In other words, it is persistent distress relating to the climate and ecological crisis. Importantly, although painful and distressing, Goldman reminds us that climate anxiety is rational and doesn't necessarily imply mental illness. Though, of course, chronic stress in childhood has long-lasting impacts and increases the risk of developing mental health problems. Eco-anxiety or chronic stress, fear, worry about climate change can look very differently across different students. In particular, you might have students who experience climate anxiety for different reasons. And so when I was thinking about how to put this presentation together, I thought it might be a worthwhile approach to try to paint broad brushstrokes of what this might look like. while also disentangling the different ways children and youth can be impacted by climate anxiety differently. And I thought by acknowledging some of the different ways that children recognize and experience this anxiety, it can support the process of educators and caregivers recognizing how eco-anxiety can present itself, as well as different ways that we might consider responding to the person who's experiencing the anxiety. So, okay, bear with me. Let me introduce you to the fictional but inspired by a true story students, Petal, River, and Aspen. Trying to be clever with those nature-inspired names. Okay, so let's meet Petal. Petal has personally experienced a series of extreme weather events, which led to wildfires in her community. These ultimately caused her and her family to lose their home and access to the school she would normally attend with people she knows and feels comfortable with. In the midst of this terrible event, there was a brief time where she experienced food and water insecurity. Petal remembers watching the horrors unfold on television in a smelly hotel room, and she remembers seeing gray, uncharred trees spanning as far as her eyes could see when they drove out of their community. For Petal, she walks around with a weight on her chest, grieving for the mountains, for her home, for her community, and for the feeling of safety and security that has been lost. Petal represents students experiencing trauma and those students who are processing direct harms caused by climate-related events. The next section will focus on supporting students like Petal. But first, let's meet River. River is a child who experiences general anxiety in her daily life. She has a deep capacity for empathy, to the point actually where she adopts other people's emotions and oftentimes internalizes what other people feel as her own emotions. As River has been hearing more and more about the impacts of climate change from adults in her life and media sources, she starts to ruminate, constantly experiencing worries and fears about the future of the planet, about animal safety, and about the future of her family. One time she hears a politician on television in the aftermath of a devastating hurricane stating, "Today, Mother Earth has shown how angry she is with us." And River responds to this with a new belief that she has clearly done something to make the planet angry. As time unfolds, she feels increasingly intense pressure from all of the messaging that it is up to her and her generation to save the planet. When asked how she's feeling about climate change, she responds by stating, "I'm so nervous all the time. I overthink everything. I'm screaming inside, but no one on the outside knows it's happening. I feel like I'm just waiting for the next shoe to drop and for more horrible things to happen to our planet and to people." We'll return to River in a little bit. Aspen has disproportionately experienced discrimination such as classism and ableism his entire life, in many cases without his conscious awareness, because he's been told this is just how things go so much that he starts to believe it. Whenever Aspen thinks about climate change, he notices a feeling of sort of a mixture of things: anger, frustration, sadness, nervousness, and hopelessness. So to avoid any further stress in his life, he responds with detachment, withdrawal, and numbness, what Britt Ray labels hypoarousal. Aspen is also carrying with him additional layers of confusion, betrayal, and abandonment because of adult, both parental and government, inaction toward climate change. Aspen has what we might call anticipatory grief. He thinks to himself, "Why should I do anything? The planet will probably be uninhabitable by the time I grow up, if I even live to grow up." Returning to our student named Petal, this section focuses on trauma-informed care. Petal is experiencing anxiety and trauma as a result of living through both being personally and intimately affected by an ecological disaster. At times, she experiences visceral fears about the state of the environment and the uncertainty of the future. This chronic fear, grief, and worry creates a layered experience of grief alongside trauma for Petal. How might we educators be able to recognize that Petal is struggling with anxiety linked to trauma? In either the case that we are not made aware of her circumstances, or if we're observing and documenting the ways her trauma is presenting. Well, she may have outbursts of aggression and rage. She may demonstrate extreme feelings of unworthiness or despair, hypervigilance, repetitive behaviors, impulsivity or hyperreactivity, lethargy or an inability to concentrate, poor eating, giving her possessions away, disinterest in making friends, or general avoidance, or she may in fact demonstrate codependence on one friend or one trusted person. Now, I know that many folks here have significant experience with trauma-informed practice, but I'll offer just a few general research-based approaches to supporting children who experience trauma, such as providing opportunities for students to talk about the experience, clarifying misunderstandings, and directly and honestly, providing a predictable routine, and providing a nurturing environment. In his 2014 resource for caregivers, Bruce Perry reminds us that when a child like Petal is fleeing from an environmental disaster, there's little opportunity to offer any of the items on this list. And in the aftermath of a disaster or a life-changing event, it takes time to create individualized and responsive care. And transition periods in particular tend to be chaotic. Over time, careful observation and documentation will be the most helpful technique from an educator perspective to gather information and meaningfully develop communication and response plans for Petal and students like her. Perry and other trauma researchers suggest that educators watch closely for signs of reenactment in their play, in their drawing, in their behaviors, watch for avoidance, and psychological hyperreactivity. His research has shown children show combinations of these symptoms in the period soon after the trauma was experienced, and that these things can continue for years, particularly if not supported or given adequate therapeutic play or interventions. Children who show us educators or tell us in words or pictures or other representations that they've been traumatized need to be trusted by us with their story, need to be told their story is valid and encouraged to express themselves through play, art, conversation, and any other form of expression that they can. Finally, we can support Petal's emotional development in classroom settings by connecting often with a primary caregiver, supporting the expression of emotional responses, supporting their sense of self through relationships, helping label feelings associated with stress responses, helping them to see oneself as part of the classroom community, addressing psychological conflicts and building belief in their competence as a fully functioning human being, and learning about resilience and about one's own strengths and how to work with them to experience feelings of growth. Next, I'll return to River, who lives with generalized anxiety that is particularly awakened and exacerbated by climate-related fears and worries. How can I recognize this type of student in my classroom, since they're very unlikely to share this information openly? Students like River might present a range of behaviors that include worry or crying more than other kids their age, say they don't feel well or experience upset stomachs or muscles, headaches, exhibit tiredness due to trouble sleeping, find it hard to relax or sit still, anger easily or chandeliering, have a hard time focusing, say they aren't hungry, or they're not, or that they're hungry all the time, or you may actually see them shake or tremor, refuse to go to school. Just to offer another representation of this, some of you may be familiar with the anxiety iceberg. It was a popular image several years ago. Recently, the CDC and Gozen organization revisited this image. And rather than just the label anxiety appearing in the visible portion of the iceberg as they did before, they've actually moved that label down beneath the water level and identified ways that anxiety often presents itself in children, which includes anger, sleep issues, overplanning, avoidance, lack of focus, defiance, negativity, and chandeliering. And in case you're like me and hadn't heard the term until recently or now, chandeliering is a term apparently coined by Brené Brown, used to describe when a person is usually calm and suddenly becomes very upset for no apparent reason. It's a way she describes of offloading hurt by pushing it down and burying it until it's eventually released in a fit of rage. I don't know about you, but I can't say I've never experienced chandeliering now that I know what it is. And this self-reflection that I just disclosed about myself is an example of what I call a form of well-being literacy. And I think this is so important for all students and humans, really, but especially in cases like Rivers, because by addressing or trying to relieve Rivers' ill-being alone, I think we're missing the mark on what we truly want for her and for the planet, which is their well-being, since health is not simply the absence of illness. And I chose this image here to stand as a reminder that deliberate efforts to protect and promote students' well-being are just as important as treating ill-being. And in fact, through deliberate and sustained efforts to protect and promote students' well-being, we may actually significantly reduce anxiety and help students move into a readiness for action. Educating children, I think, on different ways to understand and think about well-being can significantly reshape the lens through which they understand their experiences and make decisions. If we view our purpose and aims in education as supporting student well-being and planetary well-being, then why not explicitly teach them about well-being theories and applications? For instance, let's unpack what is meant when CRISP states well-being is often understood as that which is non-instrumentally or ultimately good for a person or having prudential value. Let us explore the ways that three families of theories of well-being operate in our daily lives and the ways in which these theories can explain the connection between our thoughts, our feelings, and our behaviors. This idea can even now be justified and grounded in policy, since just recently Manitoba developed, as you can see there, a guiding framework that formally states the objective of attending to students' well-being. The continuous improvement learning framework explicitly refers to educating students across K-12 for the good life, which is, of course, no modest goal in light of the previously outlined challenges students are facing. But if we want to take seriously the idea of students living the good life, we must build the capacity in our education system to prioritize students' well-being in schools and develop theirs and our own well-being literacies. Though there's no one definition for well-being that everyone can agree upon, I now view the nimble and inconsistent nature of this construct actually as a strength for work in the field of education. And here are four very commonly, widely used models for well-being that all look quite differently. But as I see it, supporting students who experience anxiety that spans across communities and individuals with distinctive socio-historical backgrounds, knowledges, values, and aspirations actually requires a responsive and context-specific approach to understanding well-being. And for students like River, they will benefit from opportunities to explore what domains or areas for well-being can help restore their peace of mind and promote their overall flourishing. So with that said, I'll offer just a few approaches that might support River with her well-being, such as helping her connect with make connections, between her thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, supporting them in the process of identifying and planning powerful thoughts, modeling detective thinking as an educator to help connect events, thoughts, evidence, and emotions, facilitate consistent feelings check-ins and self-reflections, promote positive self-talk, affirmations, and identity building, and focus on well-being literacies that support areas for their well-being that they themselves identify as a priority. One final slide in this section to signify the incredible importance of play for well-being for children of all ages, including all of us who are young at heart but old in body. Play is a fundamental right. It's a fundamental right in particular for children. Article 30 of the UNCRC, United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, that was ratified in 1991, attests to this, along with the right to relax and to join in a wide range of cultural, artistic, and other recreation activities. Play is a young child's language of exploration, discovery, and expression. We play to understand the world and process thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. And I would argue providing ample time for exploration and play is essential in the daily experiences of children, particularly children like River who are experiencing chronic anxiety. Moving into the final section here, and I'm making good time, I feel. It's 4:37. This is great. I was slower when I was on my own. I'd like to just discuss how we might support students like Aspen. And I fit my nieces in this category. Aspen was inspired by my two nieces that I had a long talk with this summer, and asked them, knowing this was coming up for me, how they feel about climate change. And they said, we feel like there's nothing we can do. So we try not to think about it too much. And when I think back to my time in high school, this was a common response I would have from students when we would look at literature related to climate justice. And so I considered their responses, and I've been considering this case, I guess, of students, or this class of students. And I thought, well, I think probably student agency is where I would go with this. And anyone who knows me knows I do always find a way to include student agency in a discussion about well-being, but in particular, I think it's relevant for supporting students like Aspen. For me, Aspen's mindset is a natural product or outgrowth of a society and school system that's in denial about how we still see children. And so we'll talk a little bit more about this in just a moment, but first let's think about, what does this look like when we see students like Aspen? How do we recognize this hopelessness? Well, we might see disengaged behaviors. We might see defiant presenting behaviors in our classroom, detachment and withdrawal from their environment, apathy, a freeze stress response like my niece's, disassociation from climate discussions, and more. And so I want to continue along the sort of philosophical leanings or background that I have, and kind of throw out the question, how do you see children? Because I think our answer to this question, and how we genuinely see and understand children, or maybe the ways we've been assimilated into understanding children in our culture without our deliberate consent and knowledge, actually shapes the ways in which Aspen's environment has created his behaviors, his thoughts, and his feelings of anxiety. And so when I walk into classrooms across the city in Winnipeg, what I see on average is a schooling process that treats students like River as subordinate, underdeveloped humans that must act in compliant ways in order to move through the system or be told they are being successful. In other words, I think we still hold as a society what Tamar Shapiro labels the basic view of children, ontologically situating them as an inferior form of adults or adulthood, We see children like tiny saplings that must be reared, trained up to resemble fully fledged adults who are strong and who know better. In other words, as this picture here represents, we see children as moving from a state of being reliant and vulnerable, small, timid, developing slowly the capacities for relationships, for a sense of self and rationality, before finally achieving the capacity for genuine autonomy and full rationality. But this deficit view of children and childhood oftentimes subliminally and unconsciously limits their ability to make and act on their own decisions, and therefore limits their ability to realize their agentic capabilities and feel empowered to address the climate crisis as fully participating members of society. So even if you're involving students in building a community garden, attending to a climate march, or writing their government representatives, if they don't feel a sense of agency over those acts, that they might actually go through the motions and still feel at the end of the day the way that Aspen feels. Alternatively, if we view children as capable of independence, possessing special epistemic abilities, and capable of making and acting on their own decisions with adult care and support, we might actually avoid Aspen's plight to begin with. And this is called the diversity view. This idea of children as capable and as possessing special epistemic abilities is consistent with Hart's view that children bring amazing gifts to the world if we just listen. Children are natural philosophers. They ask questions about life and meaning, knowing and knowledge, truth and justice, reality and death. And this inquisitive mindset, if nourished and offered an autonomy supportive environment, produce not just the Greta Thunbergs or Lissy Priya I'm saying it wrong, Kangujams of the world. Thank you. Here we go. But also the voters who will decide what our political and economic mandates are well into the future. Every time we step in to teach a child something, we keep him or her from inventing it themselves. On the other hand, that which we allow him to discover for themselves will remain with him visible for the rest of their life. So how might we support Aspen's well-being? Well, I would argue we can provide an autonomy-supportive learning environment, offer opportunities for participation in all levels of the schooling process, including governance, provide a responsive environment that reflects Aspen's interests, facilitate student-led goal setting and formative assessment opportunities to support students in their learning process, focus on self-assessments rather than standardized ones, and emphasize those aspects during the learning process which promote making and acting on one's own decisions. Perhaps if we took this approach, we might be able to avoid Aspen's anxiety developing in the first place. So in closing, I'll just repeat from Harry Brighouse this idea that I really do believe schools can and should be sites for human flourishing. There are so many opportunities to curricularize well-being literacies and promote climate action. So many of them, have already been outlined in this webinar series. I've been so amazed at the incredible sharing of resources, the incredible work that's happening in school divisions across Manitoba. Students are absolutely demonstrating their potential and capabilities for not just agency, but also for systemic change. And it has actually led me to be quite hopeful and heartened after listening to my colleagues in this series. So just a few additional ideas that I've come across from colleagues in literature: music, dance, drama, art goals for climate change, meditative mathematics, quick writes, linking lessons to educational goods for well-being or domains for well-being across all subjects, exploration and play included as a component in every assignment and rubric, student-led nature-based inquiry projects across all subject areas, self-assessments and metacognitive components reflecting on climate. And I just want to end off by promoting a little shameless self-promotion here, that if you're interested in exploring this topic further, I am one of many researchers in the province who participates in a research collective called Wellbeing and Wellbecoming in Schools in Canada, led by Dr. Thomas Falkenberg. It's my second shout out. On this website, you can find resources. There's a podcast series, all in the Manitoba context on well-being in schools, and you can find out information about events. For instance, our book launch coming up in January that you're all invited to, celebrating the book that was published on well-being in schools in Canada. And I think that's it for me. 45 minutes on the nose. I hope that's okay. Thanks, Will. Back to you.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Heather. That was absolutely wonderful. Folks, if you have questions for Heather, you are welcome to throw them into the chat. I see we got one question there. You can also put it into the Q&A box. But yeah, absolutely. What I really appreciate about your presentation, Heather, is that you recognize and articulated so well that eco/climate anxiety is multifaceted, that it isn't just one thing and it isn't just a monolith, that students come by it in different ways and present in different ways, and therefore there are different ways that teachers can and should respond. But also I think what came through in your presentation was that we can be proactive about this. Working and supporting students with eco-anxiety does not have to be just reactive. We can be proactive, and that through thinking about student well-being and through an autonomy lens and an educational goods lens, we can do things in our classroom that can stymie the likelihood of them presenting in more challenging ways. The other thing that I noticed is that a bit of a theme that's emerging in the webinar series is that the economic determinism model and the desire to have an education system that is producing young people to become adults that are ready for the world of work is exacerbating this, right? And is increasing the likelihood that students are going to present these ways and not have their concerns, their voices heard. So I really appreciate that. Question in the chat from Kiara or Ciara. Are there any resources you would recommend on the diversity view? Any significant books or scholars?
Well, the two scholars I draw from are Patrick Tomlin and Anka Gauss. I can type those in maybe. Anka Gauss has edited several books on children's well-being. One, I think, is just called The Nature of Childhood and Children's Well-Being. I can't remember the name of the other one, but I can type their names in the chat if that's helpful.
Fantastic. And while you're doing that, Heather, is there another book that more broadly speaks about well-being in schools that you would like to highlight that is maybe just hot off the press?
I know, usually I have it right beside me and
Ah,
but it's called Wellbeing in Schools in Canada, edited by Thomas Falkenberg. Definitely check that out, and you can see details hopefully on our website soon for the book launch that we'll be hosting in January. All are welcome at the University of Winnipeg.
Cool. And I am going to throw a link to that book in the chat there for folks to have a look at it. Any other questions that folks have for Heather? Mike put it in there too. We got your back here, Heather. Heather, one question that I had is there is a series of curriculum reforms happening right now. So we've recently got a draft science curriculum. There is a draft physical and health education curriculum. Social studies is coming soon. I believe that they're looking at reopening English language arts. What would you like to see in those curriculum documents that can speak to supporting young people around eco or climate anxiety? Is there a specific curriculum? Would you like to see it across the curriculum, and how would that manifest?
Yeah, well, as I said, and as you pointed out, thank you so much. I would like to see the further development and acknowledgement of the relevance and importance of well-being literacies, which in my view is preventative. It addresses climate and eco-anxiety it can address it at every stage to support students in understanding their emotions naming their emotions, um, connecting their emotions to their thoughts, making those explicit, and then connecting, their thoughts to their behaviors. And really what we ultimately want is for them to feel empowered to act, right? This idea of autonomy and self-determination. But what I find is that so much of the narrative in the climate advocacy realm in K to 12 is quick to jump to the act stage when actually there are a host of students that don't have readiness yet, just like readiness to learn in other areas, right? We want students to be ready to learn science education in classroom, and we also want them to be ready to learn in the field and act in the field in all the different ways. And so attending to their emotional life through acknowledgement of its significance in the learning process for me is a vital and overlooked aspect of education. And I think some documents try to gesture towards it. I think there's some good stuff in the Rethinking Assessment document, but it's typically linked to student motivation. And why do we want student motivation, or why do we want to think about that? Why do we want to jump to that? Oftentimes, I think for the sake of them learning through a banking model, like learning the things we want to learn so they can perform well on standardized tests. And I never want to deny students' own goals, which include economic stability oftentimes. I mean, I don't fault students for wanting to acquire the skills, attitudes, dispositions that are required to enter in the labor market and have, those options and opportunities. And I wouldn't want education to be exclusively about that, certainly, and eclipse all other goals for education. And so not only that, but if we're successful in the labor market, that doesn't mean we're well or we experience happiness, and lots of research shows this. And so I think ultimately we want this because we want economic success for our students, because we want them to be well. We're all in the field, almost all of us, for good intentions, some of us for July and August, but I think most of us are there because we care genuinely about student well-being. I just think that, the way we've defined our purposes and aims has been too narrow, and the way we've defined curriculum, therefore, has perhaps just missed out on a really important component that is so badly needed today. You saw the mental health numbers around students' mental health, and we simply can't experience well-being if we don't address that in schools. I don't see what fighting chance our next generation has if schools deny and ignore the mental health component or the well-being component. So yeah, I'd love to see it threaded through all the curriculum. Thanks for asking.
Awesome. Last call for questions for Heather. Okay, so I want to send a massive thank you to you folks for turning up. I know that it's report card season, but thank you. Thanks for coming out. We have one webinar left, and I am so excited that one of our new faculty at the University of Winnipeg, Dr. Latika Raising-Hani, is joining us next week, November 12th, for a second part of Climate Justice, where she's going to look at environmental racism. So the last webinar next week, November 12th, 4 to about 5 o'clock again, Latika Raising-Hani. But once again, Heather, thank you so much for bringing this. Totally understand that you brought the caveat at the start, but this was so valuable for myself as a parent, for someone who's working with pre-service teachers who have these questions, and likewise for many folks on this call who are heading into their practicums in a couple of weeks and heading into the profession next year or the year after. So thank you again. Thank you to everyone for attending. Hope to see you next week. For those who wanted to see this again, we're going to have this posted after Dr. Raising-Hani's presentation next week. And there'll also be details that I'll share next week about how you can get your hands on some of the books that have been referenced. If you can complete some feedback surveys for us, we're going to give you the opportunity to pick some of these books. And books ain't cheap, folks. And some of the books that have been mentioned in this webinar series are absolutely phenomenal in extending the work of our presenters. So thank you, Dr. Krepsky. Thanks, everyone, for being on this call. And have a good rest of your evening, folks.
Thanks, Will.